Today, we're really getting into something quite fascinating. We've got source materials that, well, they seem to pull back the curtain on this pretty murky world of high-stakes international political influence.
Yeah, it's quite a story. We're looking at a very specific campaign, basically an attempt by these two, let's say, highly motivated individuals from Brazil.
Right, operatives almost.
Kind of, yeah, trying to fundamentally shift U.S. policy towards Brazil. And, right at the top level, the executive level.
So this isn't just your everyday lobbying we're talking about.
No, not at all. It's really a story about how a particular narrative, a specific version of events about, judicial persecution was crafted.
Okay.
And then how it was delivered and, frankly, how it was bought by, a major world power. It led to actual sanctions, tariffs. It's quite something.
So our mission today, then, is to really analyze how this intense influence campaign managed to get such, well, stunning traction in Washington.
Exactly. And crucially, how at the very same time, it ended up being, well, a complete disaster for the political cause it was actually supposed to help back in Brazil.
Okay, so let's unpack that. Our sources, they detail this intensive effort aimed, like you said, squarely at the Trump administration, Congress too.
Yep.
And it's led by these two main figures, Eduardo Bolsonaro and Paulo Figueiredo. And the materials, they seem to paint a picture of, well, access, maybe trumping substance.
That's a good way to put it. We're going to trace this whole journey. We need to understand, the political weight, maybe even the personal motivations driving these two.
Right.
Then there's this narrative they sold, surprisingly effective, the sources say, but ultimately fragile. Fragile, yeah. And then the White House response, these really dramatic policy actions that followed. And the big question, why the sources conclude that the whole thing was, well, built on shaky ground, the credibility just didn't hold up.
And the final verdict from this analysis, it sounds pretty stark. These U.S. actions, the sanctions, those huge tariffs on Brazil, they didn't actually stop what they were meant to stop domestically in Brazil.
Not even close. And here's the twist. They actually ended up strengthening the very opposition they were trying to undermine.
Wow. So the conclusion is pretty blunt then. The sources use this phrase, aposto no cavalo errado.
They bet on the wrong horse. That's basically it. And we really need to dig into how such a, potentially massive miscalculation could happen at such high levels of U.S. foreign policy. It's quite the cautionary tale.
Okay. So to really get how this influence machine worked, we have to start with the architects, right? These two individuals, Eduardo Bolsonaro and Paulo Figueiredo, they were the engines of this lobbying effort.
Absolutely. And their backgrounds, they provided this potent mix. You had political legitimacy on one side and maybe intellectual credibility, or at least the appearance of it on the other. That combination was key to getting the attention of, high-level U.S. folks.
Let's start with Eduardo Bolsonaro. He's not just some random guy, obviously.
No, definitely not. He's a federal deputy, PLSP, and, of course, the third son of the former president, Jair Bolsonaro. So, carries the name.
And his role here was serious, it sounds like. Our sources say he actually, left his duties in Congress?
Pretty much, yeah. The indication is he dedicated himself full-time, specifically to run this lobbying campaign in the U.S. This wasn't a side gig. It was like his main political mission at the time.
So more than just a family messenger, the material suggests some people in the U.S. saw him as the South American rep for the movement. What exactly is that?
Well, the movement is one of those terms, right? It can be a bit fuzzy, but in this context, the sources seem to be pointing to that broader network, the global network of populist, national conservative figures and groups that were aligned with the former U.S. president.
Okay, so he had a recognized role within that international circle.
Seems like it. And his activity level, it just shows the intensity. The sources mention this number, 77 reported meetings. 77. With Trump supporters.
Yeah. Just think about the logistics, the sheer effort involved in that kind of sustained push. His job was clear. Hammer home one message.
Which was?
Perseguição judicial persecution. Against his father, against his allies. And he was explicitly asking for punitive U.S. sanctions against the Brazilian officials he saw as responsible. He was the political face using that family connection, which, the Trump circle seemed to trust implicitly.
But okay, political connections are one thing. You need more than that to really swing policy, right? Especially serious stuff like sanctions. Which brings us to the other guy, Paulo Figueiredo.
Exactly. Figueiredo brought something different to the table. He provided, let's say, the intellectual cover and, crucially, a very compelling personal story.
Okay, tell us about him. He's a journalist and influencer based in the U.S. now.
Right. And his family background is, well, pretty significant in Brazil. He's the grandson of General João Figueiredo.
The last president of the military dictatorship. The very same. That lineage is important context here. In Brazilian politics, that name immediately places him within a certain ideological sphere. You know, the traditional anti-communist nationalist right.
So when he talks about rule of law or judicial overreach,
it carries a certain historical weight, maybe a specific kind of legitimacy for certain audiences anyway, even if it's controversial.
But what's really striking, according to the sources, are his academic credentials. That seems like a contrast.
It really is. And he seems to have used it effectively. Formally trained in economics, specializations from places like Harvard, LSE, MIT. I mean, these are globally respected institutions.
Right, serious places.
So when he shows up in Washington, he can present himself not just as, you know, some partisan commentator, but as a serious, credentialed intellectual, someone whose analysis, you know, deserves attention.
And this polish, this intellectual veneer, was important because his whole involvement stemmed from a very personal fight.
Yeah. Deeply personal. He'd been a TV commentator back in Brazil, quite vocal against the Supreme Federal Court, the STF. And because of that, he himself became a target of the very judicial measures he was criticizing.
Let's pause on that, because the scale of those measures, that seems key for why U.S. policymakers might listen. What exactly happened to him?
Well, according to the sources, it was pretty severe. We're talking about his social media being blocked, his bank accounts frozen, even his passport confiscated.
Wow. Okay, so for a U.S. audience, hearing about a journalist or commentator facing that?
It sounds like extreme overreach, right? Blocking speech, seizing assets, restricting travel. It hits differently, perhaps, than it might be perceived domestically in Brazil in that specific context.
So he becomes Exhibit A.
Absolutely. When he made his case in Washington, he wasn't talking hypotheticals. He could show, you know, here's the proof. My livelihood is frozen. My speech is censored. I can't leave the country. He embodied the alleged persecution. It shifted the argument from just political disagreement to something that looks like a human rights issue.
And that personalization, that was then weaponized for the lobbying effort.
Immediately. In D.C., he was actively pushing Trump administration, pushing Congress for sanctions against the main target of their campaign, Minister Alexandre de Moraes. And he specifically invoked the Magnitsky Act.
Ah, the Magnitsky Act. So framing it directly as corruption and human rights abuse.
Precisely. He could use his own situation as a textbook case, fitting neatly into that Magnitsky framework which the U.S. already had in place for targeting foreign officials.
But there's one more piece here, a really crucial one according to the sources. This wasn't just about the narrative, it was about access, like pre-existing access.
Yes, and this seems absolutely vital. We can't overlook this. Figueiredo apparently had a prior business relationship with Donald Trump himself, something related to the Trump Rio de Janeiro hotel.
A business partnership, not just a meeting.
That's what the sources indicate, a partnership. And that history, that connection, seems to have given him this direct line. It bypassed, you know, the usual State Department channels, the vetting processes. He got his foot in the door, right into the inner circle from the very beginning.
So he didn't have to build trust from scratch.
He'd essentially banked it already through commerce.
Yeah.
That connection seems to have been the golden key that unlocked this extraordinary level of access for their campaign.
Okay, so we have the players established,
Yeah.
the political heir, Eduardo Bolsonaro, and this credentialed, personally aggrieved insider, Paulo Figueiredo. Now, let's get into the mechanism. How did they actually use this access? How did they build and sell this narrative that our sources are calling, well, fragile? Or maybe more bluntly, how did they sell smoke to the White House?
Right, the campaign itself, the narrative had to be, as you said, simple, but really powerful. They took this complex domestic situation in Brazil, investigations, court decisions, political fights, and they distilled it down into a clear story of violation of rights and judicial persecution aimed at Bolsonaro and his allies. But, as we touched on, just complaining about Brazilian politics wouldn't be enough for U.S. action.
They needed that American angle.
Exactly. They had to translate this messy internal Brazilian conflict into something that felt like a direct affront to American values or interests. That was the core challenge.
So how did they do that specifically? What were the claims?
Well, the narrative focused heavily on allegations of censorship, and these processos ilegítimos, illegitimate legal processes. They painted the actions of the Supreme Court, especially Minister Moraes, in regulating political speech or investigating disinformation. They painted all that as inherently corrupt.
Politically motivated attacks on the opposition?
That was the frame. But then came the masterstroke, as you called it earlier. They broadened the lens. They started actively framing these judicial actions as attacks on the rights of American citizens.
Oh, okay. And who was the prime example of an American citizen being harmed?
Well, Paulo Figueiredo fit the bill perfectly, or at least close enough with his U.S. ties and presence. They used his very real, documented situation, the frozen assets, the confiscated passport, to internationalize the conflict.
So the argument became, look, if a Brazilian court can do this to someone connected to the U.S., someone speaking out, then American values, American interests, maybe even American citizens themselves are under threat.
Precisely. It creates this really stark black and white picture for U.S. politicians, especially those already inclined to be suspicious of international institutions or foreign courts. It wasn't just messy Brazilian politics anymore. It was presented as Brazilian judges actively targeting freedom of expression and harming Americans or people close to them.
That simplifies things dramatically, doesn't it? It cuts through the complexity of Brazilian law and politics.
Completely. It creates a clear good guys versus bad guys narrative, which, let's be honest, often plays well in Washington's political climate.
And the results of selling this narrative, the level of access sounds pretty extraordinary.
Astonishing, really. Our sources talk about constant daily contact, direct access to President Trump's advisors.
You have to ask, how common is that?
For foreign lobbyists, especially ones directly involved in a legal fight back home.
It's incredibly rare. It really speaks volumes about the trust that must have existed, likely stemming from that prior business relationship Figueiredo had. He wasn't just another lobbyist knocking on the door.
And this real-time access, it created a kind of feedback loop.
A potentially dangerous one, yes.
Yeah.
The sources suggest that promises, or maybe even just hints, of upcoming U.S. sanctions were being fed back to Bolsonaro supporters in Brazil almost instantly.
So people back home here, Washington is about to act.
Which reinforces the idea that Eduardo and Paulo are being effective, that their lobbying is working. This boosts their credibility back home, which then probably strengthens their hand when they go back to their contacts in Washington saying, see, we have momentum, our people expect action.
They're basically creating the evidence for their own effectiveness in real time. It seems like it, creating and closing the loop simultaneously. But they didn't just focus on the White House. They knew they needed broader support.
Right. They went after Congress, too.
A very sophisticated, multi-pronged approach on Capitol Hill. This wasn't just about getting the president on board. It was about building legislative backing, getting key committee chairs involved, creating a sense of political consensus for taking action.
And the sources list some specific high-profile meetings.
They do. Meetings with Representative Brian Mast, who was chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. I mean, that's a crucial gatekeeper for anything related to international relations and sanctions.
Okay, that makes sense. Who else?
They met with Chris Smith. He's co-president of the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission.
Ah, the human rights angle again. Very strategic.
Extremely strategic. Getting a meeting there, getting her case heard by that commission, it helps formally frame the STF's actions within the language of human rights abuses, making it seem like a legitimate concern under existing U.S. frameworks for scrutiny.
And the list goes on.
Yep. Talks with Maria Elvira Salazar, who was the Republican assistant whip. Interlocution with Representative Corey Mills. It wasn't random. It looks very targeted. Key players, influential positions.
And they even got questions asked in public hearings.
Yeah, they apparently coordinated with some members to specifically question the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, at the time in public hearings about these Brazilian judicial issues.
So forcing the administration to address it publicly on their record.
Exactly. It moves the narrative from private lobbying conversations into the official public record. It makes it harder for the administration to ignore. It becomes a stated foreign policy issue, not just an internal political discussion. This whole effort shows a really sophisticated understanding of how Washington works, how you need to build pressure from multiple points to get major action like sanctions.
Okay, so the campaign, in terms of getting Washington's attention and buy-in, was incredibly successful. Flawless, almost. Which leads us to the next phase. The White House actually taking action. Moving from listening to doing something based on these claims. This is Section 3, right? The consequences of successfully selling that smoke.
That's right. And the sources are clear. The administration didn't just listen. They fully adopted the narrative. They explicitly used the language of Eduardo and Paulo, violation of rights, judicial persecution internally, as the justification for the actions they took against Brazil.
So the lobbyist talking points essentially became official U.S. government rationale.
It appears so. And the actions themselves were, well, not subtle. First, they announced personal sanctions against the main target, Minister Alexandre de Moraes.
And that's a big deal, using the Magnitsky Act.
Huge deal. It's crucial for listeners to grasp the gravity of invoking Magnitsky. This isn't just a diplomatic protest note. It's legislation designed to target foreign officials specifically for gross human rights violations or significant corruption.
So the U.S. government was formally labeling a sitting Supreme Court justice of a major ally
as a corrupt human rights abuser. That's the implication. It's a massive diplomatic slap in the face, and it lends enormous international weight to the claims made by Bolsonaro and Figueiredo. It validates their narrative on a global stage.
That alone would create huge waves, but they didn't stop there.
No, they doubled down with economic pressure, sharp economic retaliation, a massive 50% tariff imposed on Brazilian products.
50%, that's extreme.
Extremely aggressive, especially against a strategic trading partner. You usually see tariffs like that only in major trade disputes, breakdowns in relations, or when there's a finding of really egregious unfair practices. It signals a severe level of disapproval.
And the rationale given for these tariffs is tied back directly to the persecution narrative.
Directly. The justification reportedly cited a tax à l'élection, a tax on free elections, and the direito à livre expressão, the right to free expression, supposedly, of Americans. They meticulously connected the economic pain they were inflicting back to this political dispute involving the Brazilian Supreme Court.
So they convinced the White House that the internal judicial stuff in Brazil was so bad, so anti-democratic, that it warranted hitting the entire country with a 50% economic penalty.
That seems to be the logic they successfully sold, that the actions of the SDF were fundamentally undermining democracy and free markets to such an extent that this kind of massive economic intervention was justified.
So these two actions, the Magnitsky sanction on Moraes, the huge tariff that's the absolute peak of the lobbying success.
Absolutely. The sources use this term, grandiloquência das sanções, the grandiloquence, the sheer bombast of the sanctions. It captures the overwhelming dramatic nature of the U.S. response.
Contrasting maybe with how effective it actually turned out to be.
Precisely. There was clearly a belief in the administration that this massive display of American power, based on the information they'd received, would just stop the Brazilian judicial process in its tracks. Game over for the proceedings against Bolsonaro.
It's like they went all in, betting everything on this one big, decisive move.
Exactly what it looks like. They got exactly what the lobbyist asked for. Punishment for the judge, economic pain for the country. The administration must have felt, having acted so forcefully, that the desired outcome was basically guaranteed. But as we'll see, this entire high-stakes gamble was based on a fundamental misunderstanding, or perhaps a deliberate misrepresentation, of Brazil's own internal dynamics.
Which brings us to the fallout, the reckoning, the political blowback, the policy failure, and the confirmation that the narrative they bought was, indeed, fragile. The grand gesture. It didn't work.
It failed immediately and spectacularly to achieve its main goal. Despite all that intense pressure from the U.S., the highest levels, the judicial process against Jair Bolsonaro just kept going.
It did stop. The sanctions didn't pause anything.
Not according to the sources. They state quite clearly. The judgment proceeded on schedule. It kept its judicial character, moved forward without significant external influence. The U.S. sanctions, the tariffs, they didn't intimidate the courts or halt the proceedings.
So right there, the core premise of the lobbyists collapses.
It completely falls apart. Their whole argument rested on the idea that enough U.S. pressure could override Brazilian judicial independence. They might have successfully framed the STF's actions as political persecution for a Washington audience,
Right.
but they totally failed to account for the internal momentum of the judicial process and maybe the deep-rooted constitutional protections the Supreme Court has within Brazil's own system. It's about sovereignty.
So the U.S. essentially bet that its political and economic leverage was stronger than Brazil's commitment to its own judicial sovereignty.
And it lost that bet badly. But the failure wasn't just that the sanctions were ineffective. It actually created this huge unintended backlash. It backfired politically.
How so?
Well, inside Brazil, these U.S. actions, the Magnitsky designation, the tariffs were almost universally seen as exactly what they look like. Ingerencia externa, foreign interference.
And the opposition. They must have jumped all over that.
They absolutely did. Instead of intimidating or dividing Bolsonaro's opponents, the U.S. intervention handed them this incredibly powerful, unifying rallying cry: nationalism, sovereignty, defending Brazil against foreign meddling.
So it actually brought forces together that might have been fragmented before.
Precisely. They suddenly had a common enemy, what they could portray as aggressive, arbitrary foreign interference. The Lula government especially gained a lot from this.
How does they benefit?
They could publicly denounce the U.S. actions, denounce the tariffs as unfair, and position themselves as the defenders of Brazilian sovereignty against this perceived external aggression. It gave them a significant boost in national support, political capital they probably wouldn't have had otherwise.
The irony is just, wow. U.S. policy, designed specifically to help Bolsonaro and maybe weaken the Lula government.
Ends up giving the Lula administration a potent political weapon to unify support behind them. It's a textbook example of an unforced error, orchestrated by the very people trying to undermine that government.
But the damage wasn't just political capital for the opposition. You mentioned economic costs earlier, hitting Bolsonaro's own base.
Yes, that 50% tariff wasn't just symbolic. It hit real sectors of the Brazilian export economy. Think agriculture, steel areas often crucial to Brazil's trade balance.
And the sources say this had a direct political consequence.
A very direct one. Those specific sectors, the agribusiness groups, the steel manufacturers, the ones feeling the direct pain of that 50% tariff, they apparently started to position themselves against Jair Bolsonaro.
Why? Because they saw his allies' actions in Washington as the cause of their economic problems.
Exactly. They could draw a straight line. Lobbying by Bolsonaro's son and allies leads to massive U.S. tariffs, which leads to direct harm to our businesses. This created real friction within Bolsonaro's traditional coalition. It undermined his support from within thanks to a policy supposedly designed to save him.
So let's recap the failure. The U.S. actions didn't stop the courts. The economic fallout actually alienated key parts of Bolsonaro's own support base.
And on top of that, it unified and energized his political adversaries by handing them the foreign interference card. It failed on pretty much every strategic level you can imagine.
Which brings us back to that conclusion. Aposto no cavalo errado. They bet on the wrong horse.
Unequivocally, the narrative of persecution, so successfully sold in Washington, just couldn't withstand contact with the actual political and judicial reality in Brasilia. This deep dive really shows how a lobbying effort, while incredibly successful in Washington terms, they got the policy they wanted, was simultaneously a recipe for utter policy failure in terms of achieving the actual desired outcome in Brazil.
It's been a really quite stunning exploration, looking at how influence works, but also how fragile policy can be when it's built on, well, maybe politically motivated information. We started with these two key figures.
Eduardo Bolsonaro bringing the political access, the family name, the connection to the movement.
And Paulo Figueiredo providing those polished credentials, that Harvard MIT background, but also that very raw personal story of persecution that clearly resonated.
Yeah, and they used those assets, plus that crucial pre-existing business link to the administration, to build and sell this specific narrative.
Right.
Translating a really complex Brazilian legal fight into something digestible, something that demanded U.S. action.
And they succeeded spectacularly in Washington.
Right.
They convinced the White House, parts of Congress, that the U.S. had to step in hard.
Which led to, as we said, the grandiloquence of the sanctions, the Magnitsky designation, that massive 50% tariff, huge dramatic actions signaling total U.S. buy-in.
But then the reality check.
Yeah.
The final chapter shows the information was, well, flawed at its core, or at least the interpretation of its impact was. The policy just didn't work.
Didn't achieve its goals, confirmed the fragility of the credibility. It backfired, seen as interference, united the opposition, hurt Bolsonaro's own supporters economically, leading straight to that wrong horse conclusion.
So the key takeaway here from these sources seems to be the profound risk involved when high-level U.S. policy gets based almost entirely on a narrative pushed by people who are deeply personally invested. Parties who are actually part of the conflict they're describing.
Absolutely. It points to a potential failure of, let's call it, due diligence. Was there enough independent verification of these claims of judicial persecution before triggering such major policy actions?
Which leaves us, and you, the listener, with a pretty critical question to think about, doesn't it? When U.S. politicians, maybe anywhere, are presented with these dramatic claims, judicial persecution, human rights violations, especially from complex situations in other sovereign nations.
Right. Claims that often fit conveniently into existing political biases or narratives.
Right. What systems, what checks and balances are missing to make sure that narrative isn't just fumasa, as the sources put it, just smoke being sold by people with a very clear agenda.
Because these sources show just how quickly Major foreign policy decisions with huge diplomatic and economic costs, can be set in motion by individuals who have the right access, but whose analysis, whose predictions turn out to be fundamentally, even catastrophically wrong.
In this era we're in, high-speed information, intense political polarization, the sources suggest access and alignment can sometimes dangerously substitute for accuracy and sound strategy.
Yeah, how does a government, any government really, make sure its intelligence, its understanding of the situation stays independent from the political echo chamber it might find itself in? That's the challenge this case really highlights.
It demonstrates that sometimes the most successful lobbying, in the short term, isn't about getting the right policy implemented.
It's just about getting a policy implemented. Any policy that serves the immediate political goal, perhaps regardless of the actual long-term outcome or effectiveness.
That is a powerful and slightly chilling thought to end on. Thank you for joining us.